Welcome to this episode of the Nothing Ventured Primer with me, Aarish. In these Primer episodes, we explore the insights and backgrounds of our guests to give you a bit of an idea of what they've been up to and how they got involved in the tech and venture ecosystem. Enjoy. This season of Nothing Ventured is sponsored by Odin. Odin helps angels, VCs, and founders to raise and deploy capital seamlessly. You can structure your SPVs and now run your funds, handle capital calls, portfolio management more smoothly and easily in one place. Founders use Odin to raise their entire round in a few clicks by simply sending investors a link and receiving investments immediately. Odin works with over 5,000 investors and over 150 emerging fund managers and angel syndicates globally. Head to joinodin.com to learn more. That's joinodin.com. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Nothing Ventured Primer with me, Aarish. Today I'm super excited to have with me in the studio Mark Kleyner. Mark is the co-founder of Dream VC. He is an entrepreneur, ecosystem builder, and early stage investor in emerging markets. Having co-founded, worked in and advised multiple startups and funds, he now drives his value through Dream VC, an investor accelerator for Africa. Mark, welcome to the studio. It's great to have you here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Let's dive straight in. So I would love to understand a bit about your background. So what did you do before getting into the tech and venture ecosystem?
Yeah, I think for me, it won't be a very exciting answer for this one. But what I have to say is that I think the most formative part of my experience was in consulting. I actually got started in research initially. And my father, who is a very passionate anti-money laundering advocate, actually got me quite interested in the nature of digging deeper beyond where people feel comfortable. And I think that's something that I definitely took into, really into heart, which is maybe why I've ended up in the VC space where you really have to dig deep to try and find the opportunity. But consulting was where I made my formative few years of my career. I actually worked both in more institutional consultancies and in small boutique ones. And I think that was where I got my main experience in problem solving, which I've kind of taken and kept with me for most of my life.
Yeah, I think it's one of those routes into the venture ecosystem that a lot of people tend to take. So get very used to understanding big problems, breaking them down into sort of smaller issues, solving those, and then sort of building those back up again. And obviously getting very good with PowerPoint decks, I guess, is probably What triggered your move into VC in that case?
Yeah, I think for me, probably the main trigger point was working in consulting. I realized that most of the clients that I really enjoyed working with didn't actually remember me after a project had happened. So what they wanted me to do was come in and solve their problems. And if we did a good job and the problem was solved, then it was their solution. If we did a bad job and the problem wasn't solved, then it was the consultants who had messed it up. But it wasn't a case where you had some accomplishment, something was done, and then you could say, hey, I did that. NDAs, confidentiality about clients. I couldn't actually go out and say, we did this for this company that went on and accomplished something. And I saw a couple of individuals who had left consulting and gone into building their own startups. And I thought that was really exciting. So actually, initially, I was planning to jump into the startup space, and I partially did. But in the process of moving into the startup space, I found that maybe because I'm someone who is a bit of an adrenaline junkie, I really like the idea of keeping myself super busy all the time. Actually, when I went to startups, they said, oh, maybe you should consider working for VCs because they're the ones that have a bit of this problem solving that you like from consulting. You get to work with multiple companies at once, and then you still have the crazy work-life balance that you have in the startup space. It's kind of a middle ground.
This season of Nothing Ventured is proudly sponsored by Emerge One. Emerge One provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups and scale-ups. They work with businesses from C to Series B that have been backed by some of the UK, US, and Europe's best venture capital funds. They provide support from capital allocation and management, KPIs and reporting, fundraising support, financial modeling, investor relations, and investor management. Come check them out at emergeone.co.uk when you're scaling fast and have need of a CFO. It's that generalist approach, I think, right? Which obviously lends itself very well to consulting, but equally to investment or any sort of portfolio career, right? I think, what we do at Emerge One with portfolio CFO work, if you were to speak to, 9 out of 10 of the CFOs that work with us, I would say that a big driver for them getting into that kind of portfolio fractional career is because of that ability to apply their skill sets to multiple businesses rather than just one, right? Because I think with startups as well, yes, they're very exciting. There's a lot happening, but often the lot that is happening becomes quite repetitive after a while, right? Like you are still focused on the same problem, albeit different approaches to solving that problem, right? Whereas which doesn't necessarily excite that generalist kind of mind that it sounds like you have, where you're looking for different types of problems and different problem sets and problem areas, I guess, right? And themes and theses, right?
I mean, it's funny you actually mentioned that, because there was a great experience I had where I was supposed to come in and work for a startup for several months, and I came in with the expectation of a giant roadmap. I'm going to go and do A, B, C, D, way beyond the job description.
Yeah.
And I did. And then the project finished in 2 weeks. And I was told, well, there's nothing else for you to do, because at this stage we can't do A, B, C, D. We don't have these resources. And I think that was a bit of a shock when I moved from consulting and knowing that you have any resource you want because you're taking these grandiose projects with a large multinational, to then working in the startup space. And I think it was that experience that kind of taught me, well, maybe I shouldn't go all the way to working at an early stage startup, but maybe multinational consulting is also not the middle ground. So somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the VC bubble idea started coming up.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that whole kind of scarce resource problem within startups is one that I've been actually talking about recently, and have also, had a lot of experience of working, in finance in startups. Ultimately, one has to prioritize where one spends one's time, one's capital, one's resources. And, startups are notoriously bad at wanting to do everything, but not actually having the money to do anything.
Yeah.
And, a lot of time I spend with founders is actually explaining them what they shouldn't be doing, right? Like where they should not be diverting attention to, because they just don't have the bandwidth or the means to be able to take it all the way through to the end, right? So what do you think you'd be doing if you weren't doing what you do at Dream VC then?
So, if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would definitely have said, look, running my own fund. I was working in VC at the time. It sounded really exciting. I really looked up to the GPs who seemed to be everywhere, going to conferences all the time, interacting with startups, having an amazing career. But the longer I've spent in VC, the more I've realized that the glamour that most people put to VC, it comes with the same shine as the glamour that people put in front of startups.
Yeah.
You think startups are all about going to a TechCrunch battlefield, displaying on a huge conference board, announcing a $200 million round, but actually 99% of the time you're doing sales or putting out fires. And in the VC case, you're basically doing the same thing, except you don't even have a product. You're trying to convince people to invest in you. So most of the partners end up being incredibly tired, exhausted fundraising all the time. And the investment period is only a few years of the 10-year typical fund cycle. So I think initially I would have said an early stage VC, but now if I wasn't doing Dream VC, it probably would be something that's growth stage. So at least Series A, Series B, where you have enough capital that the VC can actually experiment. It can do things that potentially are more risk-seeking, but with the ability to go wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas early stage VC, you can't go wrong on too many investments, so you're out of money.
Yeah.
So I think that would probably be kind of the middle ground, though things are going well, so I can't really see why I would stop with Dream VC by this point.
Yeah, no, I get that. And interesting, obviously, here on this podcast, we talk to a lot of emerging fund managers. It's probably, I would say, a good 60% of the guests that we've had on have been emerging managers. And yeah, you get that feeling of graft on a daily basis. And to your point, right, you're selling to LPs, you're selling to startups. Why should startups take money from you versus someone else? And again, you're only doing that for maybe 3 years out of the whole fund cycle. And then you've got to go back into it. And often, you may actually be fundraising that whole time. I think one thing that startups and founders, and it's still incredible to me that a lot of founders are shocked when they hear this, is that VCs probably spend as much, if not more time fundraising as startup founders do, right? And the reality is, if you're going through a first close, a second close, if you are going from fund 1 to fund 2, you've got to be able to show your metrics in exactly the same way as a startup. But, the problem with venture is that you only know if you're right, like 10 years down the line. So yeah, it's really tough. And I think, that very early stage, it's to your point, incredibly tiring. I think you have to be very, very motivated to want to do it. And as one of our guests has said to me in the past, venture is the last job you should do, not the first, right? Because it's the sort of thing you should do once you've built up your career, your reputation, you're able to kind of go out there and weather that storm. So let's talk a little bit about Dream VC itself then, right? Because this is, it's not an accelerator as we would understand it. It's not, it's not a fund as such. So what does it do? Who's it for? What are the geographies it operates in? And why, from your perspective, do you think that it's special?
Sure. Well, a lot of questions bunched in one, so I'll try and hit them all in the head. So I guess, firstly, what does it do? Well, I think that's the most common question we get asked. We're like, investor accelerator, what does that even mean? I need a dictionary from some VC specialist. And the reasoning is we didn't come up with that terminology. Actually, we took that terminology by looking at what a couple of other programs were doing who were specifically trying to create more investors.
Is this would be programs like what, Newton Venture Program?
Also included Venture University, what we saw 500 startups doing for a few years, programs out of Berkeley, out of Stanford. So I think for us, the inspiration wasn't so much things that had come up in the last few years, but more so what had existed in the past as the status quo of how someone would essentially be confident in becoming a successful fund manager. And I think the problem that most people don't think about when we talk about African VC or emerging markets investing is most people immediately, when you say emerging markets, they say, oh, there's a dearth of capital. We need more capital, more funding for startups. Of course, more funding at pre-seed, at seed, at Series A. Ask anyone and they say more funding. But what does more funding mean? More funding doesn't mean that we have investors coming out of thin air and putting their money, billions of dollars in FDI towards startups. We've already seen that. That's been the last 50 years of funding into India, into Africa, into LATAM. And that doesn't necessarily trickle down towards technology or job creation. What we mean is having more sustainable investors. But where do they come from? Well, investors usually learn from experience, from precedent. So you have to teach investors, create investors, get those investors to the point where they have funding so that then there is this investment pipeline to invest in the startup pipeline. And what we realized when we were running MZZ Africa, which was my project before we went into Dream VC, it wasn't something we started. We took it over from a guy who would go on to actually join Village Capital. But what we realized was there was a lot of talk about supporting startups through accelerators and incubators and startup hubs. I think more than 1,000 now in Africa as of 2023. But there were very few people actually thinking, how can we create more investors? Everyone just seemed to take that for granted. Well, of course, if we create 10 times more startups, there'll be 10 times more investors. But we didn't see that. In fact, we saw quite a opposite trend where startups would all gravitate towards some investors. So there'd be some investors struggling to find 2-3 deals a month, and then you'd have the YCs or the startup bootcamps attracting 2,000 applications per spot, which is ridiculous. It's great for them, sure, but it's not great for the startups because very few of them would actually be able to get in.
Yeah.
So that's how we came up with what we were doing. And what Dream VC was doing was solving that gap or that issue through a couple of different things. One, we realized that investors to exist need training. So we started from that. We created essentially what we called a fellowship or training program to educate aspiring African-focused investors. African content, African-tailored case studies introduced by African practitioners who had experience of investing on the continent, building on the continent, or working with the continent. That was step one. Then, after iterating, we realized, beyond just knowing the skill set, they also need to have a network so that they're able to overcome that initial barrier. So founders know them and trust them. So they need social capital. So then a big important part of building Dream VC was thinking, how can we get you social capital as fast as possible? And that means giving your network as soon as possible. So immediately we put our effort towards that, put our heads together and essentially pulled together GPs from various funds, put together funds of funds, connections in the startup space, venture builders, accelerators. So whoever you are going into the program, you get immersed into meeting these people, whether you want it or not. And so by the end of the program, you end up having a contact Rolodex that would normally take you 5-10 years in PE or in startups. And I think finally, it was realizing that diversity is a good thing. So I think for us, we were very conscious of how it might appear, foreigners launching a program. But what we wanted to overcome was the fact that for many individuals in African ecosystems, they don't actually know what's going on across the continent. So South Africans wouldn't know what's going on in Nigeria, Nigerians about Kenya, Kenyans about Morocco. So what we did was we made the programs remote, at least mostly remote, so that people from all over the continent and abroad could also take part and then also have peer learning. And that's been something we've kind of stressed every single year, and it's worked wonders. So actually, as a result, we've seen people launch syndicates that stretch across North and South Africa, something that's almost never happened before. We've seen connections between Africans in the diaspora in the US and in Europe and Africans on the continent. We've seen collaborations between Africans and non-Africans investing in the continent, and many success stories. But the main thing is we've seen more VC funds. So more people are hiring staff because they now can find good staff across the continent from our programs. More people are creating funds because there are more people now in the VC space. And that means more people deploying capital. So we're still slowly getting there. We're definitely not the solution yet. The solution is obviously a complete revamp of the VC space. But we're getting there by creating more VC talent and teaching corporates and funds how to invest better, how to invest more actively, and how to skip the 2-year-long due diligence that some people take, so that we actually get to the point where African VC doesn't sound like an impact project, but it sounds like actually competitive ecosystem. In the same way as, you ask now Americans, British investors, and they talk about Southeast Asia as a real viable competitor. But you ask them about African projects and they say, what's the impact lens?
Yeah.
So that mindset needs to change. And to change that, we need to professionalize VC. And that's what we're essentially doing.
Amazing. I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions I've got on that, but we will tackle those in the main podcast. So look, talking about, therefore, sort of funds and fund managers in Africa, or could you name 2 or 3 that really stand out for you, whether they've been through the program or haven't? Who is really, someone to watch out for out in Africa?
Well, I think the advantage of our perspective is we don't just train the fund managers, right? We train junior talent, we train mid-senior talent, we train senior talent. So we have people who've gone through the programs and joined funds and seen kind of how the hierarchy looks like. We've seen people who've gone and actually managed the day-to-day as principals, as investment managers, and we've seen people finish the program and launch their own things. So I have a viewpoint on all 3 perspectives. There's lots of funds that I'd love to name, but if I had to pick maybe top 3 or 4, I think first one that definitely comes to mind is Founders Factory Africa.
Yep, love the guys there.
FFA, the organization that they have, the speed of response, the structure with which they're building their investment platform, we'd call it more a platform than just a fund. It's very impressive.
I think, is Sam Strum still?
Yes.
So I met him, I think, pre-pandemic. So this is going back 6 years now. And I know they've shifted, because I think one of the things that people don't necessarily understand as well is that all the various sort of geographical founders factories have their own remit and own model, so they're not necessarily set up in exactly the same way as a UK fund. In fact, from memory, I think it is very much focused on specific projects in a very specific sector. Is that right? How does it work?
Yes. So from what I understand, they both work with very early stage founders, essentially like almost an ideation venture studio, but then they combine that with an acceleration and a funding arm. And what's really great about them is they offer LPs an alternative. I think one of the biggest issues we hear from LPs is that fund managers, I don't know who gives them this advice, but they are building a cookie cutter shark model. You see almost every emerging fund manager build the same fund with the same differential principles, with the same arguments of how they provide value add. Well, if they're not bringing their own social capital and they're bringing the same fund idea as IFC has heard 100 times, as BII has heard 100 times, as DFC has heard 100 times, all of these DFIs and big investors aren't going to back them because there's nothing new. And I think what FFA was doing is very new. They're basically explaining that a venture studio fund can work in Africa and it can actually have outsized returns. And we've seen venture studios accomplish amazing things in emerging markets with Rocket Internet and a couple of other notable examples. So I think FFA are kind of leading the charge there. So definitely I would give them a well-deserved shout out. I think something else that people forget about is we all focus on funds that are focused out of the US or out of Europe. But I think a notable shout out could probably go out to some East Asian or South Asian funds. For example, comes to mind Uncovered Fund or Vered Keppel Africa Ventures. I think these two have been funds that are very lean, but have punched way above the weight of some international funds in actually being on the ground when necessary, giving founders the light hand approach when necessary, but being more hands-on when necessary, and most importantly, bringing in corporate attention to invest in Africa rather than taking African startups abroad to the US. So I think a problem what you see with many startups that scale to the US or to Europe is quite often funds bring them in, and then these startups essentially are almost no longer African. They shift their entire team, they move everything to the US or to the UK. But what I saw with some of the Japanese investors, for example, like Uncovered Fund and Vered Keppel, is they're actually bringing corporates to invest in African startups directly alongside the funds. And that for me sounds like sustainable development at a grassroots level and potentially a pathway to exit in the process.
Got it.
So I really like what they do. And I guess the last shout out I'd give would probably be someone like DFS Labs. I don't know if you've heard about these guys, but one of the few funds that says they're thesis led and are actually thesis led. A lot of funds say they're thesis led, but then as soon as AI comes along, oh, we're investing in AI now.
As long as it's tangential.
Yeah, Web3 now, next big thing. And half of these funds don't have the mentor network to actually invest in it. Some do. If they do, great, good on them. But many don't. So I think that's a problem with being too generalist.
Yep.
But what I really like it is when someone actually says they're going to do something and they carry through. And DFS is a small team, but it's consistently focused on digital commerce and essentially sectors around digital commerce. They are very thesis-led. They run very efficient programs. And the team seems to be handling what really is a competitive fund at a very early stage. So definitely well-deserved shout out to them as well.
Amazing. I mean, those are some great names. I'll be checking them out. Obviously, I know Founders Factory very well, but definitely Uncovered, Verit, and DFS were ones that I had not come across in the past. So thank you for those. Mark, it's been absolutely incredible exploring some of your background. Can't wait to get into some more detail during the main podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Excited too. Thanks.